This morning's gospel reading is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, verses 14 to 21. Then Jesus, in the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding region. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone.
When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it is written,
"The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor."
And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. The eyes of all the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing."
This is the good news.
Thanks be to God. The genesis of our pilgrimage on October 19 and 20 was in the Racial Justice Ministry's successful pilgrimage to Selma and Montgomery in 2023. In reflecting on that, the RJM turned closer to home, to sites here in Colorado that also bear painful histories of racial injustice and to which we are more deeply and directly connected. As a member of that ministry, I volunteered to begin planning, and I was joined by three others, Monica Rukowski, Margot Pickett, and Allison Ham, to form a committee, and I engaged Stuart, who is a native of Southeast Colorado, to help. In preparation for the pilgrimage, we sponsored 2 adult education forums. The first featured a local group called Right Relationship Boulder, which has been working toward understanding, atonement, and reconciliation for the Boulder region with the native tribes on whose land we live. The second was a presentation by Gil Asakawa on the history and experience of Japanese in Colorado. Each of these was valuable preparation for us.
We all have images of the cultures and peoples who were here before today's majority arrived. In part due to the displacement that made settlement possible, there are relatively few places here in Colorado where we can encounter this history. Our first stop was an admittedly imperfect such encounter, a collection of Native American art and history at the Koshari Museum in La Junta. The images, environment, and stories there helped center us in the lives of the peoples who inhabited the land before.
Next, we visited Bent's Old Fort National Historic Site, an adobe recreation of the most important trading post along the Santa Fe Trail on the borderlands between the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute empires and Mexico and the growing U.S. empire. The Arkansas River in southeast Colorado is that border. And seeing the vast lands surrounding it allowed us new insights into the lives of the people and cultures whose land it was. We learned that in the time before, there was cultural exchange and some vision of what might have been a different future for those lands and their peoples.
From there, we traveled to Grenada, the location of the Amache relocation camp, where nearly 10,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated during the Second World War. We learned that the history of Japanese in Colorado stretches back long before the camp was established, with many immigrants coming to settle on the new irrigated lands which were opened up in the process of non-native settlement. But the Japanese experience took an unjust turn here when thousands were forcibly relocated from the West Coast to camps like Amache ostensibly for security reasons.
Our final stop was the location of the bloodiest day in Colorado history, the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site, where 230 Cheyenne women, children, and elders were massacred in a pre-dawn attack on November 29, 1864. The people encamped there had been promised safety and included some of the most important leaders and elders committed to peacemaking with the white settlers. The troops were led by a colonel who was also a Methodist minister and who thought the battle in the so-called Indian Wars would secure his military promotion. Many of the troops in the raid actually came from Fort Chambers here in Boulder, and this fact raised for us the possibility that members of our own early congregation might somehow have been implicated in the event.
The National Park Service ranger talks, both at Bent's Fort and particularly at Sand Creek, deepened our understanding of events more than we expected. Through it all, we realized the value of actual experience of place and of a pilgrimage together, sharing together as a group, in coming to understanding. The natural settings we visited added immeasurably to the experience for us. These geographies of injustice are understood more profoundly by being in the space, looking down into the dry riverbed of Sand Creek, walking among the remaining foundations and the rebuilt guard tower at Amachi, seeing the landscapes, breathing the air, hearing the wind.
Doing so helped us to understand their histories and our history through those events, to listen for the voices circulating there, to hear their stories, to learn from each other, to think about how our stories are linked to theirs and to the tragic and unjustified events that made modern Colorado and our beloved home possible. The people, their ancestors and descendants, and the land remember. And we must remember the lessons learned here as warnings for our own time.
1 week later, we all came together for a period of reflection here at the church. These were deeply shared experiences, and we are joined by pilgrims who have shared and will reflect for us this morning. The two of us felt privileged that even though we were responsible for keeping a very tightly planned schedule on track, we were able to experience the weekend as pilgrims ourselves.
The group, 1 week later, the group reflection in our time together the following week soon moved to action, with a number of ideas emerging to be guided by the racial justice ministry. That the congregation consider organizing a youth pilgrimage following the same route. That the congregation develop and use a land acknowledgement. That we continue to research possible connections between our congregation and Fort Chambers and Sand Creek. That we support the work of the Right Relationship Group here in Boulder in their summer youth enrichment camp, which will bring Cheyenne and Arapaho youth here to camp in their traditional tribal grounds. That we find ways to continue to bring learning opportunities to the congregation, and that the church consider a new covenant based on right relationship with Native peoples.
I knew next to nothing about the Sand Creek Massacre before our visit, our pilgrimage. And as we gathered on a plateau looking down at the Sand Creek, before we fully assembled, I stood close to that edge looking down at the creek, and I asked the park ranger where was the encampment, and he framed it for me, and it looked to be about a quarter of a mile. He said along the Sand Creek there, and in back of it as well. And I asked him about the cottonwoods, and they're lightly populated there, and I said, do you think they've changed much? He said, oh, they might have moved, but they're probably about the same. And then we sat down on those bleachers you just saw, and he went in specific detail the events that led up to the attack itself, and then the aftermath of it. But I'd like to tell you about the impacts of that visit that it had on me. When I look down at that scene of the creek, I see it frequently, but each time that I see it, it transforms to not just as it looked 3 months ago, but it transforms into a village of 100+ teepees and 750 women, children, elderly, and several chiefs, including Chief Niwot, aka Left Hand. Those chiefs were the epitome of peacemakers. Next, after listening to his detail that was specific and dramatic on the part of the park ranger, over the last 3 months, I think of those details and they play through my mind in a chronology. I think about the conflicts that existed with our own westward expansion, about the Cheyennes getting forced in particular to lands that could no longer meet with subsistence for them. That led to them attacking people along trails. It led to fear, hyperbole, hysteria on the settlers' part. It led to opportunism on some. And so I think about events like these chiefs meeting in Denver with Governor John Evans and Colonel John Chivington from Boulder to negotiate peace. I think of their humility, their reconciliation in coming to that table, and of Evans and Chivington's clear unwillingness to negotiate for peace. Those chiefs left with bewilderment on what to do next. They went to a friend at Fort Lyons, which is 40 miles south of the massacre site. They went there because Major Wynkoop was a friend of theirs. He had already visited a larger encampment at the Smoky River 40 miles east of the massacre site. He won their respect. So his guidance to them was to go up to Sand Creek, 40 miles north of Fort Lyons, and they were under the protection of the U.S. Army. Meanwhile, Colonel Chivington, who had won a skirmish with the Confederate Army in New Mexico, saw his clear path to general stars on his epaulet. It was to have a successful attack on Indians. Now, for me, the guy epitomizes the definition of scoundrel. This is a man who was a Methodist minister in this town and had openly said that the only good Indian was a dead one. So he had no clear objective for peace. He had the opposite in mind. And I see him transition his clothes into a colonel's uniform here and go through the logistics of organizing that attack. He rode over 200 miles to southeast Colorado. He commanded the U.S. Colorado Infantry and Cavalry. And first he stopped at Fort Lyons to say he needed an attachment of soldiers for the attack. Commanding major there, along with Captain Silas Soley, vehemently protested. It was unnecessary. These were not warriors there. They were under the protection of the U.S. Army. It did no good. Chivington outranked them. So now they had 765 soldiers that attacked beginning at 6:30 in the morning on November 29th, 1864, 161 years ago. They cut the horses loose first so the Indians could not escape. They broke into a V section so they could get the Indians in crossfire. The attack lasted 8 hours. And in particular, for some reason, I keep visualizing some of those Indians trying to hide themselves on the banks of the creek. 230 women, children, and elderly, along with most of those chiefs, died that morning. Next, I think about the impacts afterwards. 40 miles east at Smoky River, encampment of about 2,200 Indians with at least 200 to 300 warriors. I think about their outrage and sadness when they heard that news. And I think next about the many missed opportunities for peace along that way. I think about the opportunities that Governor Evans and John Chivington had that they passed up for their own advancement or their perception of it. I think about the moral certitude of somebody like Captain Silas Soley at Fort Lyons that said, this is wrong. And during the attack, and a number of soldiers underneath him would not engage. Shortly thereafterwards, Soley wrote to the War Department and to Congress about what really happened, resulted in 3 hearings, 2 congressional and 1 War Department hearing, all concluded that it was an unnecessary massacre. Chivington did not get his promotion. He resigned and fell into a loophole of law where he couldn't be prosecuted. Captain Soley was later assassinated in an alley in Denver. I think about the opportunities that settlers had as individuals. Could they have stopped in some way the hyperbole and hysteria? Could Chivington here have been stopped? Could the major at the fort thrown him into the brig and sent 700 plus soldiers back home and risk their own court-martial to save the massacre from happening? And then I think about my own opportunities now. I think about the potential conflicts that I have in front of me as a person. And I find opportunities every day to take a different path, to bifurcate away from those conflicts. And I feel rewarded from having chosen those. On a larger scale, I see us on fertile ground for potential missed opportunities. And I think they stand before us like boulders on the foreground, just like the creek was. And I think that those opportunities are somewhat visually obscured by a ground fog. But that fog is going to start clearing tomorrow. And I'd like to set some bearings for at least one of those opportunities to play a part, no matter how small, in seeing that that opportunity is not missed. And I'd like some company along the way in that journey. Thank you for the invitation.
Earth, teach me to remember. Earth, teach me stillness as the grasses are stilled with light. Teach me suffering as old stones suffer with memory. Earth, teach me humility as blossoms are humble with beginning. Teach me caring as the mother who secures her young. Earth, teach me courage as the tree which stands alone. Earth, teach me limitation as the ant which crawls on the ground. Teach me freedom as the eagle which soars in the sky. Earth, teach me resignation as the leaves which die in the fall. Earth, teach me regeneration as the seed which rises in the spring. Earth, teach me to forget myself as melted snow forgets its life. Earth, teach me to remember kindness as dry fields weep in the rain.
I'm honored to be part of this group that has shared today, so thank you for the invitation. In October, I had the opportunity to visit the Amache Japanese internment camp in southeast Colorado with 36 other members of our church and friends. The trip was thoughtfully planned by Karen and Stuart Hoover, with visits to learn about the indigenous tribes who were driven out of Colorado in the Sand Creek Massacre. Thank you, Kent. Stark reminders of our nation's difficult history. My portion of this reflection focuses on Amache. But as someone who is half Japanese and whose father spent part of his childhood in a similar internment camp in Arizona, this visit carried a deeply personal weight for me. My grandparents immigrated to the United States from Hiroshima, Japan, and settled in California, where they became strawberry farmers. In the wake of Pearl Harbor, their lives and the lives of 120,000 Japanese Americans in the western side of the United States were upended. My father was just 2 years old at the time when he and his family were rounded up and transported to an internment camp in Arizona. He doesn't remember much about the trauma of being taken away, but he recalls fragments of camp life, small kindnesses, the efforts to create normalcy in an unjust circumstance, and the crafts made by those who tried to bring beauty into bleak surroundings. When I walked through Amache, I was struck by how little remains today. Just remnants of buildings, a reconstructed living quarter, a cemetery with a few graves, and sparse interpretive signage. Designated as a National Historic Site, it felt hauntingly bare. With the context provided by the audio recordings and the stories of those who lived through it, Amache might have, without those audio recordings and the stories of those who lived through it, Amache might have seemed just like an empty gray landscape of scrub brush and gravel. But those voices, journals, and memories brought it to life, helping me imagine what it was like for families like mine, living in hastily built barracks, enduring harsh weather, and finding ways to keep hope alive in the face of injustice. One part of the visit that stood out to me was learning about the crafts created by all the camps, Amache included. Deb Rassler lent me a book that she had on Japanese American crafts from that time, objects made from found or recycled materials or from mail order supplies. This resonated with me because my family had always kept a small wooden bird that was crafted by a friend of the family, as best we can tell, when they were interned. This simple handcraft bird has always been a cherished object, but after seeing similar crafts and learning more about the resourcefulness and resilience it took to create beauty under such bleak circumstances, it feels even more meaningful today. These expressions of creativity reminded me of another symbol of resilience unique to Amache, the Amache rose. This hardy plant, cultivated by Japanese internees at the Colorado camp, continues to bloom in the area to this day. Seeing it on the front of today's bulletin feels especially poignant. Just as the crafts reflected the ingenuity and determination of those interned, the Amache rose stands as a living reminder of their strength and ability to create beauty, even in the harshest conditions. The visit brought to life what my father and extended family experienced during this time. Japanese American families were given less than a week to sell or store their belongings before being forcefully relocated. Many lost their homes, their farms, and their livelihoods. And at the end of the war, when the camps finally closed, families like mine often had no place to go. My father's family, with no relatives east of Nevada, boarded a train to New Jersey, where they found work and housing through Seabrook Farms. This visit opened the door for more conversations with my father, who just celebrated his 87th birthday on the same day as Martin Luther King. He shared memories of how, after the war, he and his siblings were driven by a powerful desire to be seen as American, to work hard and succeed despite the deep prejudice they faced. Their stoicism, determination, and quiet resilience have shaped who they are, and by extension, who I am. Visiting Amache reminded me of the importance of bearing witness to difficult histories, not to dwell in guilt or shame, but to learn, to reflect, and ensure that we do not repeat the mistakes of the past. I am grateful for the opportunity to have visited, for the chance to have meaningful conversations with the congregation and my father, and with this church community, which gives us space to grapple with complex histories like these. May we, like the Amache rose, be the people who persevere, who find ways to create beauty and hope in hard places, and who work toward a future where all are treated with dignity and respect.